the conditions in the country are of such a confusing nature at the moment that stuff just comes in all the time. We've had authorities in Lexington, Kentucky, tell our affiliate there, WTVQ, just a short while ago, that a plane is missing from radar in their airspace, and it is simply going to take time in order to sort out whether or not we're looking or at an operation or somehow witnessing or being on the edges of an operation that is continuing to unfold in various parts of the country. We still indeed have a missing aircraft or a missing or not accounted for aircraft from United Airlines. We had a crash near Pittsburgh here today, about which we have only that knowledge, no understanding whatsoever whether or not it is relevant to the others. We do know that the President and the Vice President, and interestingly enough, former presidents, are all now in secure locations. That's Pierre Thomas, our Justice Department reporter, connecting into his sources there to tell us all that. ABC's John McKenzie, who's out on the streets of New York, has spoken to the New York City Fire Department officials, and they report many missing firemen, perhaps as many as 200. And John Miller, in such assistance here this morning, that will come as no surprise to you because you worked these streets for so long, both before you went back to being a reporter as an official with the government and with the police department.
That's right.
And the fire department stays there. I've seen the fire department all my professional life stay there till the bitter end.
Well, you know, they are the people who are always running in when everybody else is running out, and in this case would have been the front line of the evacuating force for the World Trade Center. The fire department has a set plan for a disaster at the World Trade Center. It's an automatic second alarm, which brings more than 175 firefighters. This, of course, brought hundreds more, and their job is to go through the building and bring those people out. And there's really no telling at what stage of the evacuation they were at or how many of them were still inside when the first building collapsed or the second building collapsed.
I remember 30 some odd years ago, first coming to New York, and there was a building that collapsed, and the firefighters were ultimately the ones to die on almost the very first night I was here at ABC all those years ago. As you say, everybody's going one way and they're going the other way. John, I know that you're listening a lot to the network. By this I mean the police network, and one assumes we're not interrupting and intruding on them. I think that's pretty certain. Give us the general tenor of things at the moment.
Right now, it's a situation that's vastly calmed down. As you hear the operations, which I've been monitoring since the beginning, their voices are now level. This is much more about organizing an incredible crime scene second, but first, organizing a massive transport of casualties. They literally have passenger ferry boats, police launches, and other vessels standing by to ferry people away to outer boroughs, helicopters to do the same thing. It's really a tremendous effort to triage the people who are injured, to decide who's viable, who can be saved, who needs immediate attention, who can wait, to categorize them and tag them as such, and then to designate whether they can stand a long ride or just a short ride to the nearest available medical help. That's what's going on, and that's an incredibly large effort. On the other side, there's the investigation, which is unfolding, processing probably the largest crime scene in U.S. history, certainly larger than the Oklahoma City bombing or even the first World Trade Center bombing, or in this case, because of the size of those two buildings, the twin embassy bombings in East Africa.
Yeah, and that's the Pentagon we're looking at this morning. And I'm sorry, but we have more bad news. Lisa Stark, who covers aviation from us, reports in from Seattle that 2 United flights have now crashed. Now, just so we don't lose track of the numbers, we told you the United Flight 93 going from New York to San Francisco crashed outside Pittsburgh today. We believe now, according to our aviation sources, the United Flight 175, which was a 767 destined to go from Boston to Los Angeles, has crashed, and we do not know where. So we have 4 major commercial aircraft which have been involved in either accidents or violence today. We have the 2 at the trade towers in New York City. We're not certain, but we believe both those are somehow connected to American Airlines. We're not sure of that, absolutely sure, and that news conference in Dallas a few minutes ago didn't shed much light on the subject. And we have 2 United Airlines flights involved in crashes. We do not know the circumstances of those crashes. One of them flying from New York, just outside New York, to San Francisco, and the other flying from Boston to Los Angeles. And we may or may not have another aircraft because we have no certainty yet what the aircraft was, who it belonged to, really what size it was, that penetrated the outer ring of the Pentagon this morning, right through to the inner ring of the Pentagon's courtyard there, and caused what ABC's Jack McWethy called heavy casualties there. So we have 4 significant commercial aircraft carrying, in some cases, well more than 100 passengers who've all been involved in acts of violence on purpose or otherwise today. And Mayor Giuliani, Mayor of New York, who will probably get a better feel of this before anybody else at the moment, has now described a tremendous number of lives lost in the New York the attack on the New York trade towers, and it doesn't come as any great surprise to anybody. The mayor begins to give us some sense of magnitude which is beyond that which we are merely speculating and or talking about, even though we know that many lives have been lost. And ABC's John McKenzie, who's just a couple of blocks away from the World Trade Center at a makeshift fire command center. Look at that again. I mean, it is stunning. John McWethy at that makeshift fire command center has had a battalion commander tell him that as many as 200 firefighters are principally unaccounted for. So it is no wonder that all across the country today, at airports and at public sites, many which have been closed from the west all the way across to the east, people are holding their breath. Don't wish to be melodramatic about it, are holding their breath as to whether or not there is one more, or should I say, another incident to come. And that was because the shock was so profound watching on television as we did this morning to see the second aircraft come in and crash into the other of the twin trade towers. There it is, which have now both collapsed. And it is, in some ways, a reminder of what happened when the Challenger exploded. And the constant repetition of the explosion of the Challenger on the Challenger space shuttle just drove it into our collective consciousness all across the nation. What we had witnessed together, though were clearly unable to feel in the same way as those people in the immediate area. I just want to pick up some other reaction coming from around the country and around the world. It's very interesting, the reaction we've had immediately, officially, from the highest ranks of the Palestinian Authority and from Afghanistan. I think we can hear Chairman Arafat, Yasser Arafat, in just a moment, but the Taliban ambassador to Pakistan, it is in Afghanistan where the United States believes Osama bin Laden has been most carefully given sanctuary, if not protected by the Taliban. But the Taliban ambassador to Pakistan has condemned what he called terrorist attacks on the United States on Tuesday. He said in a dispatch from Reuters out of Islamabad in Pakistan, this is a terrorism act and we strongly condemn it. And then from Kabul itself, the capital of Afghanistan, a spokesman for the rulers there said that the Saudi dissident, Osama bin Laden is a Saudi Arabian citizen, could not be responsible for a spate of terror attacks in the United States. I don't understand that particularly, but here's the quote from him. It says, what happened in the United States was not a job of ordinary people. It could have been the work of governments. Osama bin Laden cannot do this work, neither us, said the Taliban spokesman to the Reuters news agency in Kandahar, which is a city on the southern part of Afghanistan. This could have been the act of either internal enemies of the United States or its major rivals. Now, there are a couple of things. John Miller talked to me about this because you've been to Afghanistan. You went to see Osama bin Laden. In every organization, anywhere in the world where governments or organizations have been somehow connected to terrorism in the United States mind, real or not, people are just waiting. There's going to be some kind of response to this. When Osama bin Laden blew up those embassies, I guess it was before you went into Afghanistan. They attacked his camps. They didn't get him.
They sent 75 cruise missiles at $1 million apiece into his camps based on intelligence that he would be meeting there with his leadership.
Right.
He was not there, and they didn't get him. They destroyed his camps. I think that at the time or point that the government and the Bush administration identifies, not to the standard, and this is the way they've been working, not to the standard you would need to prove in court, but to the satisfaction of the administration that they know who's responsible. They will not deal with this as a criminal matter first, but as a military one first, and retaliate against someone somewhere. Too early to say who. One of the things about bin Laden that is so misunderstood, and his name has come up a few times today, is how he actually operates. More so than launching these operations himself at his direction from his own organization. And there are instances where he's charged with doing exactly that. In many more of the cases, especially of operations they shut down, the U.S. government takes the position that he's basically a foundation, that any terrorist group can approach him and say, we want to go to work. He'll provide the training, the financing, and then send them off to do their work, essentially with grant money, seed money, training, logistical support. So it doesn't necessarily have to be him to have his fingerprints on it.
Fires are still burning in the Pentagon, no surprise there. As John McCarthy and Barbara Starr both reported for us, this building penetrated the outer ring of the Pentagon and set many offices on fire on a variety of levels, and there are about 6 or 7 stories. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stories anyway in the Pentagon today. In at least one section they are alight. And as I said a couple of times, the Palestinian President Yasser Arafat, who's deeply engaged in a war now with the Israeli government, has also reacted very quickly to this today to express, to be perfectly honest, I haven't heard what he said, but so let's hear what he said now. This is Palestinian President Yasser Arafat.
First of all, I am offering my condolences, the condolences of the Palestinian people to the American President, President Bush, to his government, to the American people for this terrible act. We are completely shocked, unbelievable.
Now, that's the Palestinian president, chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat, who, as I think everybody who watches the news or reads the news these days understands, is in a very, very bitter war with the Israelis, and in which terrorism has been a factor. Palestinians see what the Israelis do to them as terrorism, and certainly the Israelis and much of the world see the Palestinian and other suicide bombers who've attacked inside Israel to be terrorism of the most gruesome order, no question about that. And so we should not be surprised, as on previous circumstances, to see Chairman Arafat expressing his condolences, but other Palestinians who believe the United States is responsible for what Israel is doing to the Palestinians, or at least complicit, and is certainly supplying the Israelis arms, will be happy to see this attack on the United States today. So take a look at a scene from Jerusalem not too long ago, in which there is some celebration that the powerful United States has been harmed, has been seen to be vulnerable, has been hurt, I suppose, in the broadest sense of the word. And the people who go off to do this sort of thing, both in the Middle East now, you must remember that a vast majority of the population of the Middle East now, in all countries, is under 21, much of it under 15, certainly under 17, and the kind of tensity and intention, if one presumes this terrorism, one shouldn't, this terrorism has had its genesis or had its roots somewhere in the Middle East, or at least in people who are opposed, have just filled, brimming with anger at the United States. And we are now becoming more experienced with the notion that there are young men, for the most part, who are prepared to blow themselves up along with everybody else in terms, if they can be a service to the cause. And and they believe, and they believe, as do some people believe about Islam, that they will, by sacrificing themselves, go on to another place. It's an unfair comment on Islam in some respects, but it is certainly a motivating factor. The hatred of the United States, and the hatred of the United States is a patron of Israel. Whether you're from Afghanistan, or whether you're from Iran, Iraq, or inside the Palestinian territories, is so intense at some levels, and has become more intense in recent months, that a great many people will not be surprised at this attack today, though, like everybody else, will be amazed at the magnitude and success of it. John McCarthy at the Pentagon. John.
Peter, we are standing outside the Pentagon at this point. It has been already a long morning for rescue workers and police here. One eyewitness I talked to, who was on this busy highway outside the Pentagon this morning, said he saw an airplane coming directly over his head. It was an American Airlines plane. He could see the number on the plane. He could almost see the passengers inside as it went along the highway, started clipping off the high wires and the different light poles along the highway, and slammed directly into the side of the Pentagon. As we said earlier, Peter, the aircraft penetrated deep inside the Pentagon. It is organized in rings from the E-ring on the outside. It penetrated all the way into the A-ring in the inner part of the Pentagon. After it burned for a number of minutes, a part of the building collapsed. By the time rescue workers could get in there, the destruction was just terrific.
John, do you have any sense of the casualties?
We don't have any sense, Peter, except the size of the medical operation that has been set up here is enormous. They are anticipating the casualties. Certainly the injured will be in the hundreds. I certainly don't want to speculate on those killed.
And John, it's a little hard to get a sense of the size sometimes for the picture. Can you describe, maybe in feet or in yards, how big a penetration this is?
The roof has collapsed, Peter. There is a chasm in the side of the Pentagon that is probably 200 or 300 feet across. From the roof of the Pentagon, there is this huge V shape that has collapsed. You can see deep inside the Pentagon from the street now.
This is into the inner courtyard of the Pentagon itself.
It's into the innermost ring of the Pentagon, Peter. I have not been able to get into the courtyard, but I was told that the penetration was all the way into the deepest ring of the Pentagon.
And John, the office building, the Pentagon is about, what, 6 stories high?
It's 5 stories above ground, Peter, and several stories below. Clearly the damage is primarily above ground, but also some of those in the lower offices. I was sitting in the Pentagon when the attack happened. I was on the opposite side of the building. It shook the entire building. It was very clear that something terrible had happened. There was chaos immediately after the attack, Peter. Secretary of Defense, I walked out with the Deputy Secretary of Defense. The Marine Corps Commandant couldn't get out the door because security had locked it. It was chaos.
Okay, John, and the fires are still burning at the moment, we believe?
They are still burning. They are mostly oil fires, it appears, Peter. The fire hoses have been on the various fires for the last several hours, so they're beginning to put them out. But obviously there is still heavy gray smoke coming out of that portion of the Pentagon that was so terribly damaged.
John, there are a couple of aircraft at least around the country today which are still unaccounted for. You gave a very clear description earlier of how this aircraft had approached the Pentagon. But did anybody able to identify it as an aircraft associated with an airline?
Absolutely, Peter. The eyewitness I talked to looked up and said it was an American Airlines plane. I saw it clear as could be. It went right over the top of my car and clipped a pole right in front of where my car was.
Thank you very much, John McCarthy. I actually think that you may have said that earlier, and I simply lost it in terms, just lost it. And so we now know that it was, from at least one eyewitness there, it was an American Airlines aircraft which crashed into the Pentagon. So let me just try to get some grasp on the airplane. We have 2 United flights, a 757, which was on its way from New York to San Francisco, which crashed near Pittsburgh. We have a United flight which crashed from Boston to Los Angeles, United 175, and we do not know where that aircraft has crashed or been crashed as of now. And we have these 2 American flights, one from Boston to Los Angeles, which is a 767 with 81 passengers and 11 crew on board, talking about almost 100 people on American Flight 11. And American Flight 77, which was scheduled from Washington to Los Angeles, with 58 passengers and 6 crew members on board. And John Miller and I have been sitting here looking at each other about where these flights were going. And there's several ways to speculate about it, but you came up with one very interesting on already.
From a forensic standpoint, if you look operationally to crash these flights, it would have been just as simple to get on the Washington shuttle or the New York shuttle and crash one into the Trade Center and the other in the Pentagon. The choice of flights here, Newark to San Francisco, Boston to L.A., Dulles to L.A.
Excuse me, John, I apologize. Let me come back just because we have the New York governor here.
Sure.
Governor George Pataki, the governor of New York, I believe, is on the telephone or somewhere. Governor Pataki, do you hear me?
Yes, Peter, I hear you fine.
Well, why don't you first start off, sir, and give us your appraisal of the day so
Well,
far.
it's just a horrific scene, and everybody's pulling together. We're activating the state emergency forces, but our hearts and prayers are with the victims and the families of those victims, and we have to, at this point, just focus on trying to help as many people whose lives are at risk as possible and dealing with those who have been injured.
Do you have some sense of the magnitude of casualties?
We don't want to quantify a number, but obviously it's a horrific incident that really is just an incredible outrage against the people of New York and the people of America. But at this point, our focus is on trying to make sure that those whose lives are still at risk are as protected, and those who have been injured are treated as quickly and as well as possible.
Governor, do you believe that thousands of people have been killed?
I don't want to use a number, Peter. At this point, the goal is simply to try to help as many people as possible. We're working closely with the city, with our National Guard forces coming in to help relieve the city police and fire. Obviously, it's a situation that just cries out for people to be horrified. And but what we have to do at this point is focus on helping those who are at risk, helping those who have been injured, making sure there's an orderly removal from Lower Manhattan, and that is our focus at this point.
Governor, are you in a position to go to the scene? Are you in a position to go to Lower Manhattan? Do you think you should? Would you like to? Or are you locked down?
No, I'm in the city, but the important thing is to be able to stay in contact with the White House, with City Hall, with our statewide emergency services. We've gotten offers of support from all the surrounding states with their emergency services, and the critical thing right now is to be able to coordinate to make sure that the response is the strongest and the most compassionate it can be for the people whose lives are still at risk. And we're mobilizing National Guard units from across the state. We're getting help from the surrounding states and coordinating with the city, and that's what we have to do at this point.
Governor, what have you done about the other so-called high-profile potential targets in New York City, like the UN and the bridges and things like this? Are they all evacuated and locked down now?
UN's evacuated. The tunnels have been closed. The George Washington Bridge is open under security for emergency services coming in and people going out. We've shut down most of the mass transit. Grand Central is open under very tight security, but people who pass through the security have limited service to the northern suburbs, and we're doing the same thing on Long Island. But the important thing now is to provide as much help as quickly and as effectively to those whose lives are at risk or those who've been injured, and we're working with the city and federal officials to make sure that happens.
Do you believe that New York City is now under control?
New York City has been under attack, and until we get through this, we just have to continue to respond as strongly as we can.
And are you in a profile now? Are you in a position where you actually think there's a potential for more?
We just don't know. That's why we have to not only help those who have been injured, but also take every security step we can to try to prevent further incidents. We just don't know, Peter.
Okay. Governor Pataki, thank you very much. Governor George Pataki of New York, who is in New York City, which, of course, is where he probably belongs at a moment like this. Downtown Manhattan is saying simply that the National Guard has been called in, the tunnels are closed, the George Washington Bridge, which goes across the Hudson River from the west side of Manhattan into New Jersey. Just remember, a large segment of many thousands of people from New Jersey work in New York, and there's tremendous commerce back and forth on a daily basis. That has all been brought to a help. It's interesting to recall, John Miller, that the attack on the trade towers in '93 was launched from New Jersey, or at least the operational headquarters of the people who attacked the Trade Center were in New Jersey.
Correct. And the building of the bomb and the original conspiracy was all carried out in towns right across the river. In fact, the conspirators later admitted that they watched from New Jersey to see if the buildings would in fact fall, and they didn't. This time they did.
They did today. And Governor Pataki trying, as politicians again must on occasions like this, trying to express the horror and the commitment that the political establishment feels to those people who have died and those people who need to be rescued. It's an answer to every question about whether or not something was locked down or something. He came back every time that their priority now is to try to help those people who are in deep and, in some cases, still desperate trouble. George Stephanopoulos, one of our senior reporters, is downtown. Hey, George, where have you been? What have you seen? What do you think?
Well, Peter, I'm going to give you kind of a pool report from several of our correspondents down here of basically what happened down here in downtown New York between 9:45 and 10:45 when the two explosions and the collapse of the World Trade Center happened. At the time, I was actually in the subway heading towards the World Trade Center right around Franklin Street, and after the first explosion, the subway station started to fill with smoke. The subway cars started to fill with smoke, and the subways actually stopped. They then diverted us around the World Trade Center to Park Place, which is one stop beyond the World Trade Center. We got to that train station at around 10:35, Peter, and it was a scene unlike I've ever seen before in my entire life. As we tried to get out of the subway station and walk up into the street, it was pitch black, midnight black, snowing soot all down through downtown Manhattan. This was about 2 blocks from the World Trade Center. You couldn't see a foot in front of your face at that time. We then worked our way back uptown. All of the firefighters and police officials and National Guard are now evacuating everyone out of lower Manhattan. They're going east towards Brooklyn and north, which is where we are now, up on Canal Street. I should add as well, Peter, we had one of our reporters was downtown and had a sight line of the World Trade Center at around 9:48, which is around the time I believe the first tower collapsed, Gloria Rivera, and she saw 2, then 3, then 4 people jump out of the top floors of the World Trade Center. She was with a firefighter who said, "They're not falling, they're jumping. Watch their arms waving," and they counted a dozen people jump off the top floors.
Do you want to continue, George?
Well, right now, as I said, they are evacuating everyone else out. But just to give you another sense, Peter, all over lower Manhattan, the sidewalks, the streets are covered with about 1/4 to 1/2 inch of dust, of soot, as if it were Pompeii. Most people are pretty calm right now. They're evacuating slowly as the firefighters come in. But it really was one of the most frightening, horrific scenes I've ever seen in my life.
Thanks, George, very much. Come back anytime with a report. As you were concluding there, watching these guys go up that escalator, and if it's in the World Trade Center, we know that their cameraman got out, but we don't know about anybody else because, within an hour and something of the time these 2 attacks had occurred, these 2 buildings had completely disappeared, and you begin increasingly to see more dramatic footage. George Stephanopoulos made a reference to Pompeii near Naples on the west coast of Italy, which was buried by a volcano, and you get exactly that same sense of freezing stuff in soot and dirt, as might have occurred by a volcano. Jim Kellstrom, with whom we're long familiar, former official of the FBI in the New York office, is on the air, very deeply involved in the Flight TWA 800 investigation. Jim, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
What do you think?
Peter?
I'm listening, Jim. I
Yes.
just say, what do you think? I mean, just start, and I'll...
Well, my first thought is with the tremendous casualties and the death toll is just overwhelming. It's a day that 50 years from now, our children, if we're still teaching history, will be taught about when we went to war on American soil with terrorism.
Jim, if you had a chance to talk to your more active colleagues in the FBI at the moment about what they're doing at the moment, whether they're able to, I mean, it seems the hardest thing at the moment is to make an appraisal of all this. It just happened, and it's just, in some respects, it's happened and it's happening, right?
Peter, you're right. I mean, it happened. It's shocking, but in some ways it isn't shocking. I mean, we've had, the hatred of America played out at the Trade Center in '93. They tried to take the Trade Center down. We've had the hatred played out in the USS Cole, the bombings of our embassies in Africa. the bombings of the barracks in Saudi Arabia. So now it's being played out big time here in the United States.
Jim, what is the principal goal of the FBI at a moment like this, when all of the emergency services are brought to bear in all of these locations? What's the FBI actually doing at the moment?
I think the first concern of the FBI right now, right this second, is there going to be something else happening in the next 5 minutes, 30 minutes, hour, 12 hours? Simultaneous with that, who did it? Where are they? What do we know? What's the intelligence base? Tell us. Why didn't we see this coming? Where do we go from here? What kind of articulate, defined information can we give the National Command Authority so that we can bring the necessary massive retaliation necessary without a lot of collateral damage?
Well, Jim, thank you very much for checking in with us, and please do at any time if you have news. That photo, as Jim was talking, Jim Kallstrom, the former director of the FBI here, and a major force in the investigation of TWA 800, which blew up off the south coast of Long Island.
And the principal operator in the first World Trade Center bombing. Key investigation.
Right. But it's interesting, forgive me, no offense intended him, he doesn't have much to say either today, because in some respects there isn't much to say except the horror of it. But as we were looking at just a moment ago, listening to George Stephanopoulos talking to our reporters who witnessed the horrifying jump of some people from the top of the trade towers, you just saw a hint of the just ahead of this little piece of video here before, you saw a hint of what people were enduring at the top of the trade towers before they collapsed as a result of the intensity of the fire. And we've seen it before in other places around the world. Fire starts in a place, people often, ironically, not that it would have made any difference today, do the wrong thing, they get trapped in an open window by fire coming into their room, and finally they just jump, simply because if they don't jump, they're probably going to be burned alive. But as we have heard from, it's interesting that Governor Pataki is so nervous, and I don't blame him for a second, wanting to stay away from the magnitude of the casualties here today. But as John McKenzie reported from the fire department downtown, we got 200 fire department officials, 200 firefighters missing. I don't know whether or not this is a firefighter who's been brought, but you see in every case people getting oxygen because if it isn't collapse that kills in some cases like this, it is the deadly smoke. Anybody who's been involved in a fire knows the deadly smoke which suffocates people in a circumstance like this. But we're only getting touches, and it doesn't even have the chaos associated with it in many cases. We're just getting touches now of what has happened in these variety of places. The Pentagon are being kept, quite logically, I think, back at some distance. And in downtown, what's happened is that camera crews were downtown. I fear, to be perfectly honest, for some of the camera crews who work nothing braver than a cameraman either, who goes right in when something has happened and may indeed have been at some of those places. And it certainly takes time for video to get back from a location like this so that we get a widening appreciation of what has happened. But as I said, it's very hard to try to get some grasp now on the number of casualties. So we can do, in some cases, not more than just tell you how this is in terms of the whole country. The North American Air Defense Command, NORAD, is on the highest state of alert. And you had just made references earlier in the morning how the United States and Canada have cooperated in trying to keep the airports locked down, lest there was another aircraft on the air. But John, talk to me about this for a second, and then we'll come to this business about fuel. Sure. The North American Air Defense Command was a great factor in our lives in the 1960s.
In the Cold War,
exactly.
Yes.
During the Cold War, it's up along the Northwest Territories and some of the independent areas of the North. Nobody thinks about it anymore, and here it is on a state of alert today.
No, but you factor that in, and evincing so many images that Americans are uncomfortable with. The idea that there's a no-fly zone in New York City, in Manhattan, being patrolled by F-16s with instructions to shoot down any errant aircraft, that the same is true in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. that military people and doctors and military vehicles are coming to aid, that the National Guard is on alert. You know, the kind of images that used to only exist in the fantasies of 7 days in May, where, you know, the Army would take to the streets, which has not happened yet. They've offered assistance and military logistical assistance, but that kind of thing that Americans are so uncomfortable with unfolding here.
And I realize, by the way, just as you mentioned it, something else is very important at the moment. And again, I don't mean to say this in melodramatic terms. Where is the President of the United States? The President of the United States led, I know we don't know where he is, but pretty soon the country needs to know where he is. And it seems to, I think, me anyway, I apologize, the President needs to talk to us. He left Florida a couple of hours ago. Our people in Washington are clearly listening and checking this as best they can. But one of the important factors at the moment is that the political leadership in the country be present, as Governor Pataki was. Mayor Giuliani of New York, you know, made an appearance on the street and was caught unawares like everybody else, but Governor Pataki came out and basically told the citizenry of New York in a variety of different ways, I assume, just exactly what they're trying to do. Now, here's a bulletin about the President's whereabouts. The President is about to make a statement at Barksdale Air Force Base shortly. Barksdale Air Force Base is in Louisiana. So, if this is accurate, and we'll check with Claire Shipman and our other reporters at the White House, and John Cochran, if he can, in Florida at the moment, who's with the President today. The President's not coming back to Washington at the moment. We'll leave that for just a second. We'll talk a little more about this business of the aircraft and the fuel. We're trying to figure out why would a plane going from New York to San Francisco, Boston to Los Angeles be involved in this? It could have been any plane, though, right?
It could have been, but when you consider the advantage to a terrorist, here you have a transnational flight. It's going to be a larger aircraft in each case, but, and this is the key, because we had speculated earlier, was there some additional explosives laden in these planes to cause these incredibly large explosions? It appears who's ever planned this has picked cross-country flights that would have the maximum amount of fuel you could carry on a domestic flight. Flights going from one end of the country to the other. The kind of jet that if you slammed into a building would ensure the maximum fire and explosion possible from any flight that you could have chosen. Again, Newark to San Francisco, Boston to L.A., Dulles to Los Angeles, Washington to L.A., Boston to L.A. The planes that are being looked at in this attack today were apparently, or you could speculate, chosen to give the terrorists the very biggest bang for their effort.
And it's a very interesting point you make, because again, our assumptions tend to go when we see huge explosions like this. None of us understanding visually the power of explosives, that there were explosives on board, and so you're quite right, it may indeed have been the aircraft explosion.
I mean, John Nance could help us with this, but when you hear the amount of fuel, very flammable aeronautical fuel that's loaded onto a plane for a 3,000-mile trip or something, that's going to give you quite an explosion. Flight 800, which was an international flight, to those who saw it, was an incredible explosion.
John, if you'd sit at your station for a second, I'm just going to go and try to check one piece of information, and in that period of time, we're going to try to give you a little better sense of the disaster at the trade towers today. Here's something we've compiled, and we compile it as we go along.
I was standing next to One World Trade Center, and then all of a sudden I heard rumbling, and we all started running away from it. The glass blew out and threw me onto the sidewalk, and I couldn't see for 20 seconds. And then I started seeing vaguely the street, and I just started walking, and my eyesight came back.
I see you're bloody. You have dust all over you.
Yeah, it was bad. It was like a dust storm or something. I couldn't see anything.
How badly are you hurt?
I have no idea.
As soon as she got hit, I was thrown to a window. So I was very lucky to get out. There's a lot of people that didn't get out. There's a lot of people coming down the stairs, burnt up. It's bad.
We just come out of Tower 1. We were walking towards Broadway. They're saying, move along, move along, move along. I looked up as soon as we got across the street. I looked up, I saw the tower start to buckle. I just turned and ran, ducked down, put a jacket over my head. 3 or 4 of us huddled together, and it was just black everywhere.
Were you covered? Were you hit with debris?
No. But I mean, I was ducked behind a subway cover, so I put with the jacket over. The 3 of us, all of us huddled together. There was, dust and whatnot everywhere, but it was.
come down. The second everyone's being asked to get down, come down.
Can't even look at it. Because all I can see are people. I don't see a building, I see people. People hurt. Children without mothers and fathers tonight.
If you're just joining us, you probably already know the World Trade Center towers, the Twin Towers, the New York landmarks have collapsed and are gone. The Pentagon has been hit by an airplane, a series of hijackings apparently today at the root of this. What we know is hundreds, if not thousands, are injured, no count on the deceased yet, and that the investigation, a massive investigation, is just beginning to unfold.
But John, I stepped aside there, among other things, the moment to try to get some sort of sense from people who talk to, because as soon as this happens, people begin to think about a response. We don't expect a response to come in the immediate future by any means, but I was just talking to Charlie Gibson from Good Morning America, and he'd been thinking about the same thing, that the response to this from the United States is going to have to be massive. They have to accomplish something in some way, because so much of the response to terrorism before by a large nation such as this, which is not impotent but very limited in its capacity to operate at this kind of level. You were mentioning earlier the attacks against Osama bin Laden's training camps in Afghanistan. In retrospect, they spent, as you pointed out, more than $1 million per cruise missile. I forgot how many they sent. They didn't get anything. They didn't get anything. They didn't do anything. So it's an enormous challenge for a powerful nation to respond in an effective way. And the Pentagon is still burning, and today the World Trade Center towers have gone. Diane Sawyer is down in Times Square at the moment, and among other things, I think has been trying to get some grasp of the number of casualties involved. And it must be very difficult, Diane.
It's impossible, Peter, no matter how many people you call. And of course, no matter what the facts we get now, one can only imagine what the facts will be later. I want to give you a sense of what it's like here in Times Square right now. Because if you look outside, we have hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of people standing outside, just stopping still, a kind of respectful witness, looking up at the screens where we're broadcasting the pictures. They can't hear the sound. They are simply looking at the wordless horror and standing to show, in a way, respect. And I want to show you something else, because people have been sent home from Times Square, and across the way, the construction workers who were building the Toys R Us building next door to us just hung their signs outside. God bless America, and pray for families and victims. And we can only, of course, add to that as crisply as we try to report what's happening here today, we join them. And this is not just another story, even for reporters who've been trained to do this for so long. A few things to add since this morning. We were on the air, of course, live when suddenly we get word of that first explosion at the World Trade Center, the first building. And initially, of course, we didn't know if it was an accident. We didn't know what had happened. And then we were on the air live when the second plane came in and the second plane hit. And I want to show you now, this is what we were seeing live on the air. And as you've expressed before, Peter, the combination of disbelief and horror and simple prayer for somebody to save the people who were inside that building is all anybody can do, as an entire network is broadcasting live something so unimaginable. I have talked, as you all have, and as George Stephanopoulos reported, to the people who were inside as these scenes were taking place. We now see the first collapse, which of course took place about 10 a.m. Eastern Time, and then it would be about 28 minutes later that we would see the second collapse of the second building. And while we're watching the scene, each person desperate to stop this tape and go and do something. All we can do is relive the horror each time we see it. I have talked to people who are inside the building, one of them Fran Martin, who is the aunt of someone who works here at ABC, and she was saying that the first experience inside the building was that earthquake-like feeling a number of people have mentioned. And then something else in an eerie, silent, kind of mournful foliage. You saw paper just wafting out in all directions, and it was so mysterious to everyone. They couldn't imagine what had happened. The paper was scattering, and we've now read some 3 miles out, way across the river, the paper from those floors. As they came down the stairs, we're told that people were remarkably calm, were remarkably respectful of each other as they were making their way down, even though a number of them had lived through that bombing 8 years ago. A number of them remembered what it was when the bomb went off in the basement of the World Trade Center. And of course, as we now know, if the cyanide gas had not vaporized in those bombs, that it would have been a cataclysm even beyond what was experienced then. So they could all relive it as they were making their way down. Now we're watching the scenes as the building is collapsing and people are running from it. People are covered with this kind of spectral suit from the building's collapse itself. I want to point out again, and you've talked about it too, Peter, all the firefighters were immediately called on duty. All the firefighters immediately raced in from wherever they were to help out, all the emergency medical service personnel. This was a great display of human concern and human consideration. And you've mentioned before, we have this report that 200 firefighters are now missing, and yet they have done everything they can. Every hospital is open, every hand is on deck, every doctor is standing by in the city of New York with all this courage and struggle and still heartbreak out there in the streets right now. So that's it from Times Square, Peter.
Thank you very much, Diane. I remember working with Diane on the Millennium broadcast on New Year's Eve 2000. Diane had such a joyful time in Times Square. It is, whatever you think of New York in general, it is a place where people from around the world gather to express themselves. And so we'll go back there on occasion to get some, you really get some sense of the world in Times Square. And President Bush has been on the phone today to a variety of world leaders, clearly discussing this with them at the highest possible level, and perhaps they're all as confused as the rest of us are as to what has happened, who perpetrated these acts of terrorism in the United States, and what is to be done in response. Though this is perhaps, we're only 4 hours since this actually happened, and perhaps it is not quite the time to begin to think about the precision of a response, but a response will be required of some magnitude that will mean something from the United States if one is ever able to pin down exactly who the perpetrators were. We told you that the President was in Florida this morning, where he'd intended to talk about education today and was coming back to Washington. He's made it as far as Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, where he landed about an hour and a bit ago, just before noon Eastern time, where he's made a statement to the cameras, which we haven't got our hands on yet. But the President said that freedom had been attacked, but freedom will be defended. And the President is in touch with his national security team. Ann Compton, ABC's Ann Compton, who covers the White House for us for many years from us, tells us that jet fighters accompanied Air Force One, and that as best we can tell, the Air Force One was flying at a particularly high altitude. There are no planes taking off or landing or taking off in the United States at the moment, with the exception of Air Force One, though the Federal Aviation Administration says at the moment that 50 known aircraft, this is actually a few minutes old, 50 known aircraft are all in the sky within approximately 50 miles of their destination. So you can feel across the country that aircraft that were in flight are beginning to settle down. They were ordered to settle down by the FAA and to land at the nearest possible airport. And so that has begun to work out. Now in Washington, I think Claire Shipman at the White House or near it has some further information about the President. Yes, Claire.
Well, that's right, Peter. Essentially, what we've learned is what he told the pool cameras a few minutes ago, and we're hopefully going to see in just a few minutes, but he said that he and this government have taken steps to ensure the functioning of the United States government, that the U.S. military is on high alert at home and abroad. He said he has taken all appropriate security measures to protect Americans, He says freedom itself has been attacked and freedom will be protected. And finally, he also said he will hunt down and punish those responsible for this. Again, we're hoping to see him in person, but as you mentioned, it looks as though this may be the secure place that they've decided on for the president, at least temporarily, Barksdale Air Force Base in Shreveport, Louisiana.
I'd be really curious, Claire, and I realize how difficult it is at the moment, whether or not there's not pressure, political pressure in Washington from the members of the president's own staff and cabinet for him to show up soon in front of the country and assure them beyond his statement that freedom has been attacked and freedom will be defended, of course, because it wasn't defended this morning.
Well, I think
whether or not the president will be seen in command in a more vigorous way.
I think you're absolutely right, and I'm sure it's a delicate balance right now between the Secret Service and those who are trying to protect the president, keeping him out of sight in someplace secure, and his political advisors who would clearly like to see him make a statement. You saw how quickly he did it this morning, as brief as it was, and certainly a piece of tape that we're going to see in a few minutes, we hope, is not what they would like to see the president doing right now. They would like to see him making something of a more formal statement. But again, it could be a number of hours before the president is back in Washington and prepared to talk to us from that forum.
Okay, thanks very much, Claire. We'll come back to you anytime you want. And again, none of us should be surprised at what's happening. First of all, Secret Service is a huge, powerful, authoritative organization which takes the president's safety and other members of the senior political leadership with deep and profound seriousness, but they have enormous power. And so if you're talking between a senior political official, the president, a Secret Service official of equal stature at the moment, who's going to win that argument at the moment? And this is particularly true in a situation which continues to unfold, because while the devastation, perhaps the greatest devastation has occurred in New York City this morning, it's also occurred outside Washington at the Pentagon, and the tension is there all across the country, because not only were the United Nations and various government buildings evacuated here in New York City, but the Sears Tower in Chicago, the tallest skyscrapers in Boston and Cleveland and Minneapolis, and the Space Needle in Seattle. So the psychological effect on people in the country is huge. It may indeed be settling down after several hours, but the president and his response to this is also part of the psychological package, because the country looks to the president on occasions like this to be reassuring to the nation. Some presidents do it well, and some presidents don't. But ABC's Ann Compton is with the president at the moment, and we have her on the telephone. Annie.
Peter, it has been a frightening couple of hours for President Bush. We took off in Air Force One from Florida, where he first got word of this, and we literally, Peter, have been flying at well over 40,000 feet west, the White House unable to tell us where we were headed or how long it would take. There were jet fighters off the wing just out of our sight until we landed. And the president has spent the time on board the aircraft talking not only to world leaders but to the vice president, to his cabinet. He even checked in with Mrs. Bush, trying to get more information. We were high enough so that the Air Force was actually able to catch some television signal. We don't know much about what's gone on the ground, but he has been able to see some of it on a very fuzzy television picture. We landed here at Barksdale Air Force Base. This is near Shreveport, Louisiana, at about 11:45 Eastern Time. We were not allowed to use cell phones or give you any indication of where we were until local people noticed the plane on the ground. The president has just made a statement, Peter, a very emotional one, saying that freedom has been attacked, but freedom will be defended, saying that America's military is on its highest state of alert. World leaders have been assured that the U.S. will do whatever it takes to protect America and Americans. Frankly, Peter, I thought the president not only looked grim, very solemn, but his eyes looked somewhat red.
Annie, let me ask you a couple of questions, if I may. First of all, the president was on a education trip, ostensibly in Florida today. How much of the national security team was with him?
This is actually a skeleton team with him on a short, it was a trip that lasted only about 24 hours. He was just making his last appearance before returning to Washington. And Karl Rove, one of his senior counselors, is with him, and his press secretary, Ari Fleischer, but none of the national security apparatus, such as Condoleezza Rice, who would ordinarily travel with the president on a more substantive trip. But on Air Force One, of course, he has the full resources of communications, but he does not have the full team with him.
Well, let's talk about this for a second, because when the president took off from Florida and went immediately to 40,000 feet, and I believe actually got a fighter escort for part of the way, it reminds one a little bit of what it was like in the Cold War, because the Cold War there was always a provision that the senior members of the government, president included, could in fact run the country from a command center in the sky. Is that basically what's happening this morning?
Absolutely. In fact, the U.S. used to have 5 aircraft, now Air Force One. Let me know if we're being taken out of here. We may be scrambled out of here.
Okay.
Are we leaving? Okay, Peter, we are leaving. And
where are you going, Annie?
Peter, I have no idea. They have not told us. They have kept us... we don't even know whether we'll be able to see the president or travel with him, but we are told that he's been traveling. He will continue. They are still quite worried about his own security.
Off you go, and Ann, thanks very much for a very, very full report on the state of, and perhaps even a little bit of the mental condition of the president at the moment. And we cannot state it often enough. The country looks to him, and so he may have stopped at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, which is just where Arkansas and Texas and Louisiana all come together at an Air Force base out of the way, and he may be safe at 40,000 feet in Air Force One, but before long the country is going to expect him to be back in Washington to send, if not only a message, not just a message to those of us in the nation who look to the president for some sense of political national stability, but also to the other parts of the world where these enemies of the United States, with whom we've talked quite a lot about today, at the moment must surely think they have the United States on the run to some extent. And while the Taliban, the political leadership, political, military, religious leadership in Afghanistan said this morning that they condemned this and had nothing to do with it, and it could not have been Osama bin Laden, because he wasn't sophisticated enough to do it. It had to be a country or a government, certainly. And while the chairman of the Palestinian Authority, Yasser Arafat, came out and put as much distance as they could between them and the Palestinian people, this active in the Palestinian people, the president needs to be on station to talk it.